A walk shattered by violence. The crisp evening air carried a hint of autumn as Captain Jalen Davis walked his German Shepherd, Titan, along a quiet residential street. The rhythmic tapping of his polished boots on the pavement blended with Titan's soft panting. These evening walks had become a sacred ritual for Jalen, a way to unwind from the chaos of the precinct and reconnect with his loyal companion. Titan, with his black and tan coat gleaming in the streetlights, had been by Jalen's side for 7 years, a steadfast friend in a demanding career. Jalen had served as a sheriff for over a decade, earning respect for his integrity and dedication to justice. Yet tonight, his thoughts were far from work. He found solace in the simplicity of the moment, the quiet streets offering a brief escape from the weight of responsibility. Titan trotted alongside him, his leash slack, as the dog occasionally glanced up for silent reassurance. As they turned onto a dimly lit path lined with flickering streetlights, Jalen's sense of calm was abruptly disrupted. 2 police officers emerged from the shadows, their silhouettes sharp against the dull glow of the streetlights. Something about their posture, stiff and aggressive, immediately set Jalen on edge. Their eyes locked onto him, their expressions unreadable but heavy with intent. "Evening," Jalen greeted, his tone neutral but firm. Titan halted instinctively, his ears pricking forward as he sensed the tension in his owner. The taller of the 2 officers, a burly man with a thick mustache, stepped forward. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, his voice sharp and laced with suspicion. Jalen frowned, his years of experience as a law enforcement officer telling him that something was off. "Just taking a walk with my dog," he replied evenly, holding Titan's leash a little tighter. "Is there a problem?" The second officer, leaner and younger, smirked. "Let's see some ID." Jalen's stomach tightened. As a sheriff, he was no stranger to protocol or tense encounters. Still, this felt personal. Slowly, he reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate to avoid escalation. Titan shifted closer, his body a shield between Jalen and the officers. He handed over his ID, watching the men closely as they inspected it. Their eyes flicked to his name and title, but their expressions remained unreadable. After a tense moment, they handed it back without acknowledgement. "Captain, ha," the taller officer sneered, his hand resting on his holster. "That doesn't mean much out here." Jalen took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "If there's an issue, I'd appreciate you explaining it," he said, his voice measured. "Otherwise, I'd like to continue my walk." The younger officer stepped closer, his smirk widening. "Big man with a badge," he mocked. "Let's see how tough you are without it." Jalen's pulse quickened as he noticed the officers exchanging a glance, their silent communication heavy with intent. Titan growled low, the sound rumbling from deep within his chest. Jalen placed a reassuring hand on the dog's head, his heart pounding as the situation escalated. The taller officer abruptly shoved Jalen, causing him to stumble. Titan barked sharply, his protective instincts flaring. "That's enough," Jalen said firmly, his voice carrying the authority honed from years on the job. But the officers weren't listening. The younger one stepped forward and reached for Jalen's arm, twisting it painfully behind his back. "Think you can talk your way out of this?" The officer taunted, his grip tightening. Titan lunged, his teeth bared as he barked furiously. The officers flinched, their bravado faltering for a moment before anger replaced their hesitation. The taller officer reached for his baton, his face twisted in irritation. "Control your mutt," he barked, raising the baton menacingly. Jalen's voice cracked with desperation. "He's just protecting me. Back off before someone gets hurt." But his plea fell on deaf ears. The younger officer took a step back and drew his baton, his expression dark with determination. Titan, undeterred, stood his ground, his loyalty unwavering. "This isn't a fight you want," Jalen warned, his tone both a plea and a command. "I'm Captain Jalen Davis, and you're making a mistake." "Captain or not," the taller officer spat, "you're nothing out here." Before Jalen could respond, the taller officer swung his baton toward Titan. The dog dodged swiftly, his agility honed from years of training. But the attack only fueled Titan's determination to protect his master. Jalen's heart broke as he watched the scene unfold. He knew Titan wouldn't back down, not while he was in danger. "Stop," he shouted, his voice filled with anguish. "Leave him alone." The officers ignored him, their focus on subduing the dog. Jalen struggled against the younger officer's grip, desperate to intervene, but his strength was no match for the vice-like hold. The taller officer's frustration boiled over, and he reached for his sidearm, his intent chillingly clear. Time seemed to slow as Jalen realized the gravity of the situation. His mind raced, searching for a way to prevent the unthinkable. "Don't do this," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "He's my dog. He's my family." The officer's finger tightened on the trigger, and the world seemed to collapse around Jalen as the deafening sound of a gunshot shattered the night. Titan let out a yelp before crumpling to the ground, his once vibrant eyes dimming as his life slipped away. Jalen fell to his knees, a guttural cry of anguish tearing from his throat. The officers smirked, their satisfaction evident as they watched the captain crumble. "He's all I had," Jalen whispered, his hands trembling as he reached for Titan's lifeless body. "Why? Why would you do this?" The officers exchanged a glance before the younger one grabbed Jalen roughly, pulling him to his feet. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer," he said coldly, snapping handcuffs onto Jalen's wrists. As they dragged him toward their patrol car, Jalen's gaze remained fixed on Titan's motionless form. His heart shattered, but amidst the grief, a spark of resolve ignited. Justice would be served, not just for him, but for Titan, whose loyalty and love deserved to be honored. The night that had started with a peaceful walk had descended into chaos, but Jalen Davis was not a man to be broken. The wheels of justice would turn, and the truth would come to light. For Titan, for himself, and for every injustice that demanded to be righted. A broken spirit, a burning resolve. The patrol car rumbled down the dark, empty streets, its headlights casting fleeting beams of light on the desolate pavement. Captain Jalen Davis sat in the back, his wrists shackled painfully tight. His head slumped forward. His heart felt like it had been torn apart, shattered into irreparable pieces. Titan's final moments replayed in his mind like a haunting melody that refused to stop. The loyal bark, the unyielding growl, and then the deafening gunshot. The image of Titan lying lifeless on the ground was seared into his memory, and the grief coursing through his veins was unbearable. The two officers sat in the front, exchanging smug glances, their voices a cruel reminder of the nightmare Jalen had just endured. "Think he'll bark orders from behind bars?" The younger officer sneered, adjusting the rearview mirror to meet Jalen's hollow gaze. "Guess that badge doesn't count for much when you're not wearing it." Jalen remained silent, his body stiff and his jaw clenched. He knew better than to respond. Every word he might say could be twisted and used against him. His training, his rank, and his years of service had taught him that sometimes silence was the strongest weapon. But tonight, it felt like a hollow shield against the mounting injustice. The heavier officer let out a gruff laugh. Bet he thought his fancy title would protect him. Out here, he's just another guy who needs to learn his place. Jalen's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the seat, his restrained hands trembling with a mix of rage and despair. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Not when everything he stood for was at stake. Through the car's smeared window, he could see the dim lights of the city approaching. Each glow felt like a taunt, a reminder of how far he had fallen in the span of a single evening. The weight of the handcuffs, the aching in his bruised ribs, and the suffocating loss of Titan bore down on him like a crushing tide. But amidst the sorrow, a spark of resolve flickered within him. Jalen had spent his life fighting for justice, standing against corruption, and upholding the law. Tonight was no different. He might be battered, humiliated, and grieving, but he wasn't defeated. His voice may have been silenced in the moment, but he knew he'd find a way to roar again. The station, a mockery of justice. The patrol car screeched to a halt in front of the precinct, its garish fluorescent lights glaring down on the grim concrete facade. Jalen took a steadying breath, bracing himself for the next wave of indignities. The younger officer yanked the door open, gripping Jalen's arm with unnecessary force as he dragged him out. "Come on, Captain," the officer jeered, emphasizing the title mockingly. Time to join the rest of the lowlifes. Jalen stumbled as his feet hit the ground, the ache in his muscles forcing him to grit his teeth. The air inside the station reeked of sweat and stale coffee. The din of voices, officers chatting, phones ringing, and suspects shouting, was a sharp contrast to the isolating silence that gripped Jalen's mind. As they marched him past the reception desk, a few officers glanced up, their expressions ranging from confusion to mild amusement. Most of them didn't know who he was, and those who did seemed too shocked or too intimidated to intervene. "Hey, isn't that Captain Davis?" a voice muttered from one corner of the room. "Can't be. What would he be doing here, cuffed?" another replied skeptically. The murmurs followed Jalen as the officers shoved him into a dimly lit holding cell. The cold metal bars clanged shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the small, empty space. The two officers lingered just outside, their smug satisfaction evident. "Enjoy the stay," the younger one said, leaning against the bars. "Might be a while before you're back in that shiny office of yours." Jalen locked eyes with him, his glare unwavering. "You have no idea what you've done," he said quietly, his voice like steel. The officer's smirk faltered for a brief moment before he straightened and walked away, muttering something under his breath. The weight of grief. As the cell door clicked shut, Jalen finally allowed himself to breathe deeply. Alone in the dim, oppressive silence, the weight of the night bore down on him with renewed force. He sank onto the narrow bench, his head in his hands, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. Titan. Loyal, steadfast Titan. Jalen had raised him from a playful pup, trained him, and loved him like family. Titan wasn't just a dog. He was a partner, a protector, and a source of unwavering companionship. The thought of never feeling the familiar nudge of Titan's nose or hearing his eager bark again tore at Jalen's soul. For the first time in years, tears slipped down his face, hot and silent. He felt raw, exposed, and utterly powerless. But beneath the sorrow, anger simmered, hot and unforgiving. Titan had given his life to protect Jalen, and Jalen would not let that sacrifice go unanswered. "They think they've won," Jalen murmured to himself, his voice steady despite the tears. "But they haven't. Not yet." The ally in the shadows. Unbeknownst to Jalen, someone in the station was watching. Officer Samantha Torres, a junior officer who had worked under Jalen during a rotation, had seen the commotion when he was brought in. She'd recognized him instantly and had been appalled by the treatment he received. Torres had always admired Jalen's commitment to fairness and his unyielding stance against corruption. She knew something wasn't right. As she lingered near the reception desk, she overheard bits of conversation between the arresting officers. Just another arrogant captain who thought he was untouchable. "Did you see that mutt? Served him right. Acting like a hero." Torres's blood boiled. She couldn't stand by and let this happen, not to a man who had spent his career fighting for what was right. Steeling herself, she made her way to the station's surveillance room. If the arresting officers were as sloppy as they were cruel, there might be evidence of their misconduct. She had to act quickly and discreetly. Every second counted. The spark of hope. Back in his cell, Jalen's mind raced. He replayed every moment of the encounter, cataloging the officers' actions, their words, their intent. He knew how the system worked. He'd been a part of it for years. But he also knew that justice, though slow, had a way of catching up to those who abused their power. The door to the holding area creaked open, and Torres appeared, her face a mix of determination and concern. She approached Jalen's cell, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one was watching. "Captain Davis," she said in a low voice, "I'm Officer Torres. I don't know what happened tonight, but I know you didn't deserve this." Jalen studied her for a moment, his guarded expression softening slightly. "You believe me?" "I don't just believe you," Torres said, holding up a USB drive. "I think I have proof." Jalen's heart lifted for the first time that night. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The fight for justice begins. The quiet tension of the holding cell pressed down on Captain Jalen Davis like a suffocating blanket. He sat on the cold bench, his mind whirling with the gravity of the night's events. Titan's absence left an aching void, but the spark of hope ignited by Officer Samantha Torres's quiet promise began to kindle into resolve. If there was even a shred of evidence to expose the truth, he would seize it. Outside the holding area, Officer Torres moved quickly but carefully through the precinct. She knew the risks of what she was doing. Challenging her peers, especially in defense of someone the other officers were eager to see humiliated, could jeopardize her career. But Torres couldn't let injustice slide, not when she knew who Jalen Davis was, not when she had seen his unwavering commitment to fairness and integrity. She had reviewed the surveillance footage from the night and copied it onto a USB drive. The video was damning, showing the officers' aggression toward Jalen, their excessive force, and the heartbreaking moment when Titan was shot. Now, Torres had to figure out her next move without drawing suspicion. The unexpected visitor. The precinct buzzed with its usual late-night activity. Phones rang, papers shuffled, and officers exchanged idle banter as the chaos of the city continued its unrelenting rhythm. Torres was about to slip back to Jalen when the front doors of the precinct swung open, and a sharp voice cut through the din. "Where is he?" demanded a tall woman with a commanding presence. Her tailored suit and confident demeanor silenced the room. Torres glanced up and recognized her immediately. Assistant District Attorney Valerie Monroe, a relentless advocate for justice and a well-known ally of law enforcement reform. Her arrival was no coincidence. Monroe had worked with Jalen on several high-profile cases, and she wasn't one to back down when something smelled foul. The desk sergeant stammered as Monroe fixed him with an icy glare. "I said, where is Captain Jalen Davis?" The room seemed to hold its breath. The sergeant gestured nervously toward the holding area, mumbling something about protocol. Monroe didn't wait for further explanation. She strode purposefully toward the back of the precinct, her heels clicking loudly against the tile floor. A glimmer of hope. Jalen looked up as Monroe appeared outside his cell, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in his bruised face and the weary slump of his shoulders. "Captain Davis," she said, her tone a mixture of concern and steel. "Are you all right?" Jalen gave her a tired nod. "I've been better." Monroe turned to Torres, who had quietly entered the room behind her. "What do we have?" Torres handed Monroe the USB drive. "Surveillance footage from the incident," she said in a low voice. "It shows everything. They attacked him without provocation. The dog, Titan, was protecting him. And they—" Torres paused, swallowing hard. "They killed him." Monroe's jaw tightened as she slipped the USB into her jacket pocket. "Good work, Officer Torres. This footage is crucial." "What now?" Torres asked. Monroe turned to Jalen, her expression softening slightly. "Now, Captain, we start fighting back. The corruption runs deep." Monroe didn't waste time. She left the precinct with the footage, promising Jalen that she would ensure it reached the right hands. But Jalen knew it wouldn't be easy. He wasn't just fighting for justice for Titan. He was fighting against a culture that thrived on silence and complicity. The officers who had attacked him were likely confident that their actions would be overlooked or buried, protected by an unspoken code of loyalty that often shielded bad actors from accountability. As the hours dragged on, Jalen's resolve hardened. He replayed Monroe's words in his mind, drawing strength from her determination. But beneath his growing resolve, he couldn't ignore the ache of grief. Titan's loss was a wound that wouldn't heal easily. The thought of his loyal companion lying alone on the dark street filled Jalen with a crushing sense of guilt. A city begins to stir. Word of Jalen's arrest and the events surrounding it began to spread. In the quiet neighborhoods Jalen had served for years, residents were outraged. News of Titan's death, the senseless act of cruelty, and the unjust treatment of a respected sheriff quickly ignited a firestorm on social media. Local journalists began digging into the story, while community leaders called for accountability. By morning, the precinct parking lot was filled with protesters holding signs that read, "Justice for Titan," and "No badge above the law." The growing crowd chanted slogans demanding answers and accountability. The noise reached the officers inside the station, who exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't anticipated the backlash. The pushback. The officers who had arrested Jalen, Corporal Reeves, and Officer Bennett sat in the break room, their smug confidence now tinged with anxiety. "Did you see the crowd out there?" Bennett muttered, his usual bravado faltering. "Relax," Reeves snapped. "It's just noise. They'll move on when something else comes up." Bennett wasn't so sure. He'd seen the footage Torres had reviewed and knew it wouldn't paint them in a good light. What if someone leaks the video? Reeves leaned forward, his expression darkening. "Then we make sure it never sees the light of day." Unbeknownst to them, Torres had already taken precautions to protect the footage, sharing copies with Monroe and trusted allies. The corruption that Reeves and Bennett relied on to protect them was starting to unravel. The press conference. By midday, Monroe stood before a sea of microphones and cameras, flanked by community leaders and advocates for police accountability. She held up the USB drive, her expression grim but resolute. "This is a story about justice," she began, her voice steady and strong. Captain Jalen Davis, a decorated law enforcement officer, was attacked and humiliated by members of the very institution he has dedicated his life to serving. His dog, Titan, was killed in an act of senseless violence, and these actions will not go unanswered. She detailed the events captured in the footage, the evidence of excessive force, and the blatant disregard for protocol. "Justice isn't just about holding criminals accountable," she said. "It's about holding ourselves accountable. No badge, no rank, and no uniform should ever be a shield for abuse." The crowd erupted in applause, and the momentum of the movement grew. Jalen's resolve. Back in his holding cell, Jalen watched the press conference on a small television mounted in the corner. He felt a surge of gratitude toward Monroe and Torres, but knew the battle was far from over. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but Jalen was determined to see it through. Titan's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. He had been more than a dog. He had been a symbol of loyalty and love. And now he was a rallying cry for change. As the crowd outside the station swelled and Monroe's words echoed across the airwaves, Jalen allowed himself a moment of hope. Justice was on the horizon, and he would fight for it with everything he had. The unraveling. The precinct, once a fortress of authority, now trembled under the weight of the storm brewing outside. Protesters filled the parking lot, their chants growing louder by the hour. Signs demanding justice for Titan and stop police corruption swayed in unison as community leaders addressed the crowd. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForTitan and #AccountabilityNow, amplifying the outrage across the city. Inside his cell, Captain Jalen Davis watched the scene unfold on the small television mounted in the corner. The press conference by Assistant District Attorney Valerie Monroe had galvanized the public, turning what could have been a quiet cover-up into a citywide reckoning. Yet, Jalen's mind remained heavy with grief and anger. Titan's absence gnawed at him like an open wound, but the knowledge that people were rallying for justice gave him a flicker of hope. The backlash. While the public rallied behind Jalen, not everyone within the precinct was pleased. Corporal Reeves and Officer Bennett, the two officers responsible for the attack, sat in the break room, their confidence now thoroughly shaken. The rising tide of public scrutiny made them acutely aware of the precarious position they were in. "This is getting out of hand," Bennett muttered, pacing the room. "Protests, reporters, Monroe going public with that footage. It's like they're out for blood." "They're always out for blood," Reeves snapped, his tone more irritated than concerned. "This'll blow over like everything else. We just have to hold the line." Bennett stopped pacing, his voice lowering. "What if it doesn't? What if someone higher up decides we're expendable?" Reeves's face darkened, but before he could respond, the door swung open and Lieutenant Jacobs entered. Jacobs was a seasoned officer, known for his pragmatic but no-nonsense approach. His expression was unreadable as he glanced between Reeves and Bennett. "The captain of this ship is not going down with you two on board," Jacobs said bluntly. "You've put this department in the crosshairs, and I won't let you take the rest of us down with you." Reeves bristled. "We followed protocol." "You followed your own ego," Jacobs cut him off. "And now the whole city's watching. You're on your own." The words landed like a hammer. Jacobs turned and left without another glance, leaving Reeves and Bennett stewing in their own anxiety. The community steps in meanwhile. In the heart of the protest, Jalen's longtime friend and former partner, Marcus "Mac" McAllister, took to the makeshift stage. Mac was a retired officer, well respected in the community, and he had come out of retirement to support Jalen in his fight for justice. "Captain Davis is a man who has served this community with honor and integrity," Mac began, his voice steady and commanding. "The officers who attacked him and killed his dog, Titan, didn't just harm a man, they betrayed the trust of every single person in this city." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers as Mac continued. "We're here today not just to demand justice for Jalen and Titan, but to demand accountability from every officer who thinks the badge makes them untouchable. We are watching. We are listening. And we will not stop until justice is served." The energy of the crowd swelled, their chants echoing through the streets. Jalen, watching from his cell, felt a lump rise in his throat. Mac's words reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that justice was possible. The evidence emerges. That afternoon, Monroe called a meeting with city officials, police leadership, and community representatives. The room was tense, filled with people who were either eager to see justice served or desperate to protect their own interests. Monroe wasted no time. She began by playing the surveillance footage Torres had recovered, her voice steady as she narrated the events. The room fell silent as the video showed Reeves and Bennett confronting Jalen, their aggression escalating, and finally, the devastating moment when Titan was shot. The police chief, a stern man with graying hair, leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of barely concealed anger. "This is unacceptable," he said finally. "Reeves and Bennett will be suspended immediately pending a full investigation." "That's not enough," Monroe countered, her tone sharp. "This footage is evidence of criminal misconduct, excessive force, abuse of power, and unnecessary lethal action. I'm filing charges." The announcement sent a ripple of shock through the room. Some of the officials exchanged nervous glances, but Monroe pressed on. "This is bigger than two rogue officers," she said. "This is about the culture that allowed this to happen. If we don't act decisively, we're complicit." The threats begin. As the day wore on, the stakes grew higher. Reeves and Bennett, now suspended and under investigation, began to realize just how much trouble they were in. Their fear turned to anger, and their anger turned to desperation. "We're not going down for this," Reeves growled, pacing his apartment. "If Monroe thinks she can use us as scapegoats, she's got another thing coming." "What are you suggesting?" Bennett asked wearily. Reeves's eyes narrowed. "We make sure this story ends before it gets any bigger." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Reeves opened it to find a man in a suit standing there, his expression cold and calculating. "I'm here to make sure that this doesn't escalate further," the man said cryptically, stepping inside. Reeves and Bennett exchanged a wary glance, realizing too late that their situation was spiraling out of their control. Jalen's resolve strengthens. Back in his cell, Jalen received a surprise visit from Mac. The retired officer had pulled every string he could to see his friend, and the sight of him brought a rare smile to Jalen's face. "Mac," Jalen said, his voice filled with emotion. "You didn't have to." "Of course I did," Mac interrupted, sitting down across from him. "You think I'd let you face this alone?" The two men talked for hours, their conversation ranging from memories of their time on the force to the fight that lay ahead. Mac's unwavering support bolstered Jalen's spirits, and by the time he left, Jalen felt a renewed sense of purpose. As night fell, Jalen sat alone in his cell, his mind no longer consumed by grief but by determination. Titan's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. He would fight for justice, not just for himself, but for every person and every life wronged by the system he had once believed in. The tipping point. The protests outside the precinct showed no signs of dying down. What had begun as a local outcry for justice for Captain Jalen Davis and his loyal dog Titan had turned into a citywide movement. Media outlets covered the story relentlessly, and #JusticeForTitan trended nationwide. The crowd outside swelled daily, a mix of community members, activists, and families holding vigil for what they saw as a reckoning long overdue. Inside the precinct, tensions simmered. Officers who had once laughed at Jalen's arrest now avoided eye contact, wary of their own vulnerability under public scrutiny. The commanding officers walked on eggshells, grappling with the fallout. The blue wall of silence that had protected misconduct for years was beginning to crumble. Jalen's first victory. The sound of jangling keys jolted Jalen from his restless thoughts. He looked up to see Assistant District Attorney Valerie Monroe standing at his cell door, flanked by Officer Samantha Torres and Jalen's longtime friend, Marcus Mac McAllister. "You're being released," Monroe said, her tone brisk but warm. "The charges against you have been dropped." Jalen blinked in surprise. "How?" Monroe smirked. "The video footage, the public outcry, and a little strategic pressure. Let's just say the department realized keeping you here was a mistake they couldn't afford." As the officer unlocked his cell, Jalen stood, his body still aching from the night of his arrest. He clasped Monroe's hand tightly. "Thank you. You can thank me by helping us finish what we've started," Monroe replied. "This isn't over, Captain. Not by a long shot." The streets erupted in cheers. When Jalen emerged from the precinct, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Protesters held up signs with Titan's name and Jalen's photo, chanting in unison. Jalen stopped at the top of the steps, overwhelmed by the sight. Mac placed a hand on his shoulder. "They're here for you, brother," Mac said. "For you and for Titan." Jalen raised a hand in gratitude, his throat tight with emotion. As he descended the steps, people reached out to shake his hand, offer words of support, and thank him for his service. But Jalen's mind was already focused on what lay ahead. His release wasn't the end of his fight. It was just the beginning. The internal struggle. Inside the precinct, Corporal Reeves and Officer Bennett sat in the break room, their faces pale as the cheers from outside filtered through the walls. Their suspension had turned into full-blown isolation as other officers distanced themselves, unwilling to be dragged into the growing scandal. "This is getting worse by the day," Bennett muttered, his voice shaky. "They're not just coming for us. They're coming for the whole department." "Keep it together," Reeves snapped, though his usual bravado was gone. "They don't have anything solid." "They have the footage," Bennett shot back. "And now Monroe's out there with Captain Davis. We're done." Reeves slammed his fist on the table, his frustration boiling over. "We don't go down without a fight." But even Reeves couldn't deny the sinking feeling that the walls were closing in. The Allies mobilized. That evening, Jalen, Monroe, Torres, and Mac met in a modest office rented by community organizers who had rallied behind the cause. The room was filled with papers, maps, and a large whiteboard tracking the timeline of events. Monroe stood at the front, her energy crackling with determination. "We have the public on our side," she began. "But public opinion alone won't bring systemic change. We need to build a solid case, not just against Reeves and Bennett, but against the culture that allowed this to happen." Torres stepped forward. "I've been digging into department records," she said. "There's a pattern of complaints against both officers. Excessive force, racial bias, even falsified reports. Most of it was buried, but I've pulled together enough to show a clear history of misconduct." Jalen nodded, his face grim. "That's a start. But we need more than paperwork. We need witnesses, whistleblowers, anyone willing to step forward." Mac leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That won't be easy. The culture in that precinct is toxic. People are scared." "Then we give them a reason to speak up," Monroe said. "We show them that the truth will protect them. Captain Davis's case can be the tipping point, a dangerous encounter." As the group strategized late into the night, Reeves and Bennett grew increasingly desperate. Emboldened by their fear and resentment, they decided to take matters into their own hands. They tracked down Jalen's address, convinced that intimidating him would silence the growing movement. Under the cover of darkness, they parked a block away from Jalen's home. The two men crept toward the house, their movements cloaked in shadows. Inside, Jalen sat by the window, his thoughts consumed by Titan's absence. The house was eerily quiet without the familiar sound of paws padding across the floor. A faint noise outside caught his attention. Jalen's instincts, honed from years of police work, kicked in. He moved silently to the front door, peering through the peephole. The sight of Reeves and Bennett lurking on his property sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. Grabbing his phone, Jalen called Mac. "I've got company," he said quietly. "I need backup." The tables turned. Minutes later, Mac arrived, along with Torres and two trusted officers who had aligned themselves with Jalen. As Reeves and Bennett attempted to break into Jalen's garage, they were caught off guard by the glare of headlights and the sound of approaching footsteps. "End of the line," Mac called out, his voice steady but commanding. Reeves and Bennett froze, their bravado evaporating under the scrutiny of their peers. Torres stepped forward, her hand on her holstered weapon. "You've got two choices," she said coldly. "Walk away now and face justice, or keep digging this hole and see where it gets you." Realizing they were outnumbered, Reeves and Bennett raised their hands in surrender. They were escorted away, their attempt at intimidation now another nail in their coffin. A call to action. The next morning, Jalen addressed a crowd of supporters from the steps of City Hall. His voice was strong, but his words carried the weight of his grief and determination. "Titan was more than a dog. He was my partner, my protector, and my family." Jalen began, his voice steady. "What happened to him, and what happened to me, is a symptom of a broken system, but we have the power to change that." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy palpable as Jalen continued. "This fight isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been silenced, every life that's been devalued, and every injustice that's been ignored. Together, we can build something better." As Jalen stepped back, the crowd chanted his name, their voices echoing through the city. For the first time in days, Jalen felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. Titan's sacrifice had not been in vain, and the fight for justice was far from over. Justice for Titan. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows over the city. The precinct parking lot, once filled with protesters, had become a command center for a movement. Volunteers handed out water and flyers detailing the story of Captain Jalen Davis, Titan, and the events that had ignited a fight for justice. Community leaders worked alongside activists and lawyers to ensure that the momentum wouldn't falter. Inside the courthouse, Assistant District Attorney Valerie Monroe prepared for a pivotal hearing. The charges against Corporal Reeves and Officer Bennett were to be formally presented, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The courtroom was packed with journalists, community members, and officers from the precinct, all awaiting the next chapter in a case that had captured the nation's attention. The evidence unfolds. The courtroom fell silent as Monroe stood to present the case. With precise, unwavering confidence, she laid out the timeline of events. The surveillance footage played on a large screen, its contents cutting through the tension like a blade. Every second of the officer's misconduct was laid bare for the world to see. Gasps rippled through the audience as the footage showed Reeves and Bennett confronting Jalen, their aggression escalating, and the fatal moment when Titan was shot. The courtroom erupted in murmurs when Monroe highlighted how Jalen had identified himself as a sheriff, only to be ignored and assaulted. "This isn't just about two officers who overstepped their bounds," Monroe said, her voice steady but fierce. "This is about a culture that fosters arrogance, protects misconduct, and disregards accountability. Today, we begin the process of dismantling that culture." A turning point. Jalen sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, as Monroe called her first witness, Officer Samantha Torres. Torres walked to the stand with measured steps, her uniform crisp and her expression resolute. She recounted what she had seen and uncovered, the officers' history of complaints, their blatant disregard for protocol, and their arrogance in believing they were untouchable. "They thought no one would question them," Torres said, her voice steady. "They thought their badges made them immune to consequences. But that's not what justice is supposed to look like." Her testimony was a damning indictment of Reeves and Bennett, and her bravery in coming forward inspired a ripple effect. More officers from the precinct began to step forward, submitting anonymous testimonies and documents that exposed a pattern of corruption and abuse. Reeves and Bennett crumble. For Reeves and Bennett, the walls were closing in. Their defense lawyer attempted to paint them as victims of a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Their smug confidence from the night of the incident had evaporated, replaced by visible fear. When Monroe introduced witness testimony from a bystander who had seen the confrontation from a nearby house, it was the final nail in their coffin. The witness described hearing Jalen's desperate pleas and seeing Titan's valiant attempts to protect his owner. Titan was defending his family, the witness said, their voice trembling. And they killed him for it. The verdict. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge finally addressed the court. The room was tense, every eye fixed on the bench. "Corporal Reeves and Officer Bennett," the judge began, his voice measured. "The evidence presented here today demonstrates a gross abuse of power, a failure to uphold the oath you swore, and actions that have caused irreparable harm. You are hereby found guilty of excessive force, animal cruelty, and misconduct. Sentencing will follow." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom as the verdict was announced. Jalen closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. Justice wasn't complete, but this was a step forward. The legacy of Titan. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had gathered once more, waiting anxiously for news. When Monroe emerged with Jalen by her side, the roar of approval was deafening. Jalen stepped forward, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. "This isn't just my victory," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning within him. "This is our victory. It's a victory for accountability, for truth, and for every person who has ever been silenced by injustice." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Titan gave his life to protect me. He wasn't just a dog. He was a hero. And his sacrifice will not be forgotten." Behind him, Mack and Torres unveiled a statue of Titan, commissioned by local artists and funded by the community. The bronze likeness of the loyal German shepherd stood tall, his gaze fierce and protective, a reminder of the courage and love that had ignited a movement. The movement grows. In the weeks that followed, Jalen worked tirelessly to push for systemic reform. The precinct underwent a full investigation, leading to the resignation of several high-ranking officers. Training programs were overhauled, and community oversight committees were established to ensure transparency. The story of Jalen and Titan spread far beyond the city, inspiring similar movements in other communities. People rallied behind the message that accountability was essential for true justice, and that even the smallest acts of courage could spark monumental change. Healing and hope. One evening, months after the trial, Jalen stood at Titan's grave, the setting sun casting golden light over the headstone. The inscription read, "Titan, loyal companion, brave protector, forever a hero." Jalen knelt, placing a single flower at the base of the marker. "We did it, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Your sacrifice wasn't in vain. You changed the world." As he stood, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since that fateful night. Titan's memory would live on, not just in his heart, but in the hearts of countless others who had been inspired by his story. Epilogue. The new chapter. Jalen returned to his role as a sheriff, but now his mission extended beyond law enforcement. He became an advocate for reform, using his platform to speak out against injustice and champion the importance of accountability. His partnership with Monroe, Torres, and Mack grew stronger, and together they worked to ensure that Titan's legacy would endure. The precinct, once mired in corruption, became a model for transparency and community engagement, and the statue of Titan stood in front of the building, a constant reminder of the cost of injustice and the power of resilience. As Jalen walked past the statue one evening, he paused, looking up at Titan's unwavering gaze. "Thank you," he murmured, "for everything." And with that, Jalen continued down the path, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that Titan's spirit would always be by his side.